Okay, I've been putting off this video for a long time, but I don't know why I ended up choosing literally the coldest day of 2019 to do it. Let's talk about the best and easiest way to do hyperlapses. All right, so what's a hyperlapse? Well, basically it's just a time lapse with a lot of movement, more than just like a motion controller, couple feet. A lot of movement. And I'm gonna go through 4 different ways that I think are all viable ways of doing hyperlapses. Some of them are really hard and you get better results. And then some of them are much easier, which I probably prefer right now, especially in this whole YouTube filmmaking world. The first and the most legit way of doing this is with a tripod and camera. In this case, I didn't have quite a legit tripod. Forgot mine at home. That's okay. I would not suggest doing it this way. But basically, you want to set all your settings just like you would in a time lapse. All the same things apply, like having manual white balance and basically everything manual actually. And because you're using a tripod, you can actually have a really nice slow shutter speed. Therefore, you're gonna get that nice motion blur, which is always the most ideal for time lapses or hyperlapses. Once you have your settings down, this is the most important thing about hyperlapses, and that's pulling out the guidelines. And I would suggest not just using like the rule of thirds, but the one with like a million different lines. And what you're gonna do is you're gonna take one of those intersecting points on that guideline and you're gonna choose something in your frame that you're always gonna line up with that same spot. And this is really important, the most key thing about hyperlapses when you're doing them manually like this. And you can't just be like sort of close, you wanna be as close as possible. So the more specific you can be with a point, the better this hyperlapse is gonna turn out. And if you don't have it really specific and you're kind of just like, close enough, you will definitely pay the consequences and see that your results aren't as good in the end. You could also choose one of the focus points, but again, you want to be really specific. So you would even want to use like the corner of the focus point and line that up with a specific spot. You don't want to just use the overall focus point because that's going to be too big and not specific enough. Once it's all lined up, we take the photo and then we're going to move one step forward, sideways, whatever your direction is. Then you're going to line up that guideline again with that exact same spot on your frame. And then you're going to take another photo and you're going to keep doing that over and over again until you've moved your distance that you wanted to move, or you have enough frames to actually have a decent length time lapse hyperlapse. And it's really important to keep the interval between photos the same. So you would want to have, for example, always 8 seconds in between frames. So you can even turn on a timer or time lapse mode that'll do it for you. And also you want to keep the amount that you move between frames the same. So it helps, for example, here I had these little bricks on the ground that I could kind of go by and move one brick at a time between each frame. And that way we're going to have a much smoother hyperlapse. Then you're going to do this for like the next 100 hours is what it seems like. It's actually really tiring and there's no breaks. You can't just stop in between and take a break. You have to keep going or else you'll notice this weird bounce or this weird skip in the clip. So you just literally have to keep going until you're done. And sometimes it'll take 20, 30, 40, 50, an hour to do the whole hyperlapse. So it's really tiring. This is not the easiest way, but it is the best way to do a hyperlapse. Then you just take all those photos, bring them into Premiere or After Effects or whatever program you want to use and make a time lapse, which is going to be a hyperlapse because it has this crazy movement in it. And the key thing here is to use warp stabilizer. You're definitely going to need to use that. And this is kind of where you see how good you were with lining up your frames. If you didn't line it up perfectly, warp stabilizer just isn't going to be able to do it properly. So yeah, you really need to be specific. Also, the more frames, the less movement in between frames frames you have, the better, the smoother it's gonna turn out to be. Okay, so that's the hardest way, and the next kind of a little bit easier way is just using the camera. It's essentially the exact same thing, except you're just not using a tripod. Also, remember that during a hyperlapse, you need to have all your gear on you because you're gonna be so focused on getting those frames that you won't be able to keep an eye on your stuff, which I kind of forgot about while filming these ones. Okay, so I just realized I didn't really think this through. I have my one wheel and I still have to do the hyperlapse with my camera, and so I saw Jesse do this once, Jesse Driftwood. He kind of just left his one wheel in a forest. I'm gonna do the same, but I'm just gonna leave it right there beside the biggest highway in Toronto. Let's hope it's still here because I really don't want to walk back home. Oh, it's so cold. This is gonna be so bad. I'm dreading it already. So the only difference here really is that you can't use as slow of a shutter speed. Having IS will help you to use a little bit slower of a shutter speed so you can still get that nice motion blur. So that's the big difference between using a tripod and not using a tripod. But also a really nice bonus is that you can move a lot faster between frames because you're not having to move a tripod and then line it up. You can just really quickly take a step, line it up, take a photo, take a step, line it up, take the photo. And that means that there's less time in between frames, which means that anything in your frame will move a little bit slower. The problem with doing hyperlapses with a tripod is that there's a long gap between frames, which means that if there's cars or people or anything in your frame, they're gonna be just like whizzing by. They're gonna be moving so fast. So if you don't want that, you don't really have an option with the tripod method. But yeah, if I want the highest quality, usually I'll go with just the camera technique, putting it to my eye and doing it that way because it is a lot faster, and usually I don't have that much time to invest into something like a hyperlapse. You're still getting that high quality motion blur, all of that stuff, but you do need to be really careful, especially keeping things kind of level with the horizon. If you're going back and forth too much with the rotation, Warp Stabilizer has a really hard time stabilizing that footage. The results are great, but it is actually so hard doing this. If you don't believe me, just go out right now and hold a camera, take photos non-stop for the next 30-40 minutes, taking one step at a time. It's really tiring, especially when it's so cold outside. Okay, I just got done with the time lapse, and that was literally the worst experience of my filming career, I think. My hands were so cold. I just spent like the last 20 minutes trying to warm them up. They just burn right now. They hurt so bad, but I felt like I needed to push through and get the whole hyperlapse, but that just goes to show how much harder it is to do it the best way versus the easier ways. Oh, my fingers hurt. My hands were so numb that I couldn't feel them anymore. I couldn't feel where the shutter button was, so I would try to take the photo and nothing would happen. I don't know if my fingers just weren't working anymore or I was just missing the shutter button, but I literally could not feel my fingers. But I couldn't stop also. Halfway through, my hands were numb already, but I couldn't stop because that would ruin the hyperlapse, and I wanted it to be a good hyperlapse because I had a really nice setup. So yeah, it's really hard. It takes a lot of effort. Literally, this was the hardest shot of my life to get, I think. Probably. The amount I had to push through just like mentally, not worrying about getting frostbite and all that. Yeah, it was tough. And it's a great shot, but I don't know if getting possible frostbite was quite worth it. Even this one is really short, but it still took me like 15-20 minutes to set it up and to actually go through it. It's really time consuming. The one on the bridge, it's about 6 seconds of real-time footage, and it took me 30-40 minutes to get that whole thing. So it's a big investment of time, especially on a really cold day like this. And they don't always come out perfect, so you might have spent all that time and it's just complete garbage. The stabilization just doesn't work for some reason, or you've just messed up a bunch of the frames. They do not always work, be forewarned. So what can we do? Is there an easier way of doing this? Okay, so the easiest way I think right now to do this is with a GoPro Hero 7. And it has the built-in time-lapse feature, so you basically just hit record, do your movement, That's it. It's that easy. But the big downside here is that you're on a fixed focal length. You've got this wide field of view and you can't change that. And then the other big thing is that there's no motion blur. That's probably the biggest thing for me. Time lapse or hyperlapse without motion blur just kind of looks a little bit cheap. It just doesn't have that high quality look to it. It works and it's better than nothing, but it isn't quite the best. And then we get to what my favorite way of doing hyperlapses right now is, and that's with a 360 camera. More specifically, the Insta360 One X. This guy is really interesting. And so basically, you can do the same thing as with the GoPro. You just hit the record button, you do your movement, but now you have like all of these different kinds of hyperlapses that you can create from that one shot. And you can do all of this within a little iPhone app, which is really impressive. But the biggest bonus to using a 360 camera like this is that it adds motion blur in post. So you can actually go and make it into a hyperlapse and choose to add motion blur. And it's actually pretty good. Like, it's not perfect, it's not as good as the real thing, but it's really nice. And if you were to do the same thing in After Effects, it would take you forever. It's a really heavy effect to use. So it's really impressive that it's doing this straight in the app and really fast. You can do different pans or tilts with that hyperlapse. There's just a lot of options. And then on top of that, you can also film in 100 frames per second. So you can do these cool hyperlapse to super slow-mo shots, which is just really impressive, I think. I'm actually genuinely impressed by this little 360 camera that can do so much. So this right now is my favorite way to do hyperlapses. It's not the best quality way of doing it. You're always gonna get better results actually taking those photos using a tripod, but it's gonna be so much faster and so much more fun just doing it with a 360 camera. And if you don't have all the time in the world, or it's minus a billion degrees outside, this is gonna be way easier, way more fun, and you still get really nice results. And in some ways, actually better results, because you can get all of these different kinds of shots, not just that one shot that you might have messed up completely. Now it's time to find out if my one wheel's still here. Hope so. Moment of truth. Still here. Thank goodness. I guess Canada's pretty safe. Oh, now the cold ride home. Oh no, guys. I think it might be too cold for the one wheel. It's not engaging. I've tried to turn it off and on like 20 times already. Still not working. It might have been the fact that I left it lying in like snowy cold ground for like a good half an hour. Might have been a mistake. No, I do not want to walk this all the way back. Oh, the one wheels are so heavy. This is like worst case scenario. Worst case. Oh. Okay. Been walking for a good 10 minutes with this thing now. Weighs a ton. This is officially the hardest YouTube video I've ever had to make in my life. Okay, so to wrap things up, the best way is with the camera and tripod, but this is also really time consuming. It's the best because you have all the control over your lenses, the motion blur, all of that stuff. But yeah, again, you're gonna have to pay the price, sacrifice, and get that shot. Spend a lot of time on just a few seconds of footage. Also, if there's a foreground element that kind of goes through your image, Warp Stabilizer has a really tough time stabilizing that. So just so you know. Next best quality wise option is just using the camera. Again, the pros here are that you can move a lot faster. The cons are that it gets really tiring on your arms, and you can't have as much motion blur. This is my favorite way to do it if you want a really high quality hyperlapse. Then we have the GoPro option, which is probably the easiest way, the quickest way to do it, but also I think not the best quality wise. I don't like the fact that there's no motion blur. And then we have the 360 360 option where you have so many different ways that you can do it really fast. You kind of just do everything in the app in post. But yeah, I literally just took my one wheel and kind of just rode down the sidewalk and got these insane shots.
Alright, so this video did not go as I expected at all. I guess I gotta close off this video. Hyperlapses are cool, spice up your videos, blah-de-da, blah blah. People say they're fun. I would argue against that. My hands feel like they're gonna fall off, so bye. But I've never been so grateful for an elevator in my life. I parked at the top of the parking garage thinking, you know, it'd be cool and cinematic and stuff. It wasn't so cool when my one wheel died.